Hi, Dr. Amos. Here is my engagement table. The first standard I used is MS Life Science 1-2, develop and use a model to describe the function of a cell as a whole and ways parts of a cell contribute to the function. So the students are basically learning what the organelles of the cell are, of plants and animal cells are, and what they do. And this was taught, obviously, this is something that they did not learn over one day. It was taught over several days, even over a couple weeks. And we did different things through readings, teacher-led, student-led activities. The one activity that I want to point out that we used to prove the students' understanding was the students had to create a poster, and it had to have they had to choose whether they're doing a plant or an animal cell, and they had to have all the organelles of the cell that they were doing, and also they had to have a picture that relates to the organelle. So an example is the Golgi apparatus is a mailman because it packages and distributes proteins to other parts of the cell. And so they had to relate it to something in their lives. And that's where you get the develop and use a model to describe the functions. And then how we assessed them was we had individual conferences with them, and they pulled 4 sticks, and they had to 4 different organelles, and they had to tell me what the function was. And they could use their poster, but their poster only had the pictures. It didn't have words. It didn't have the description of what it did. They could use the poster to see what they compared the organelle to help them remember what that organelle did. And it proved to be very successful. The engagement we used is provide opportunities for students to talk about themselves. This might be a stretch, but I thought it was good because when they were working on their own time, they were all able to relate something in their lives. They didn't necessarily, so it wasn't, nobody had the exact same relationships made between the organelles in their life. And so that was really cool to see how different students did it based on their lives and their personalities. And the creativity from Hattie was also a big one because they were able to make of this poster what they wanted. They had plenty of time, and some students were super colorful and really, really creative, and they had to draw half of them. I forgot to tell you that. Draw half, and they could print pictures for half. And some were super creative. Others aren't as artsy and didn't have as much ability, or maybe not ability, or desire, as much as desire to do that, get as creative, and that was okay because they still would most of them did really well on the assessments because they're able to make those connections by just looking at their poster. And then the second one I did was MSLS 3-2, develop and use a model to describe why asexual reproduction results in offspring with identical genetic information and sexual reproduction results in offspring with genetic variation. So for this one, it was also, again, taught over a whole genetics unit, and the lesson that I'm focusing on is one we used to finalize it, and it was called the recipe for traits. And basically, the students just drew there's 4 different types of genes, but there's 8 genes in each envelope, and they drew them in their order and taped them together, and then they had to use the key to figure out what shape of the dog's head they got, what size of body they got, what type of hair, what eye color, what hair color, fur color, and stuff like that. And they got to create their own dog, again using creativity and from Hattie. And this to follow up on this, they had to answer questions based on results of sexual reproduction, asexual reproduction, and they also had to answer questions based on how their dog compared to other dogs, and not just because, and I told him you can't like say because like this student is a way better drawer than me. Like drawing has no effect on that, but we're looking at the traits. How does it, I have 125 seventh graders, and how do those traits, I did not have a single two dogs that looked exactly alike. There's a lot of dogs that look similar, but not exactly alike, and they had to be able to tell me that. And again, in the assessment, they were really able to grasp that, the genetic variation and how we all look different, even though we have like the same four letters make up our genetic code, just in different orders and the same number of letters. This also used high energy because as a stimulus for engagement, and the students were super engaged because they got to make their dog their own. Yes, it was random drawn. Some of them were like, I got the worst traits in the world, but they were able to also make it their own and see how the genetics really work on this whole situation. And this one was another that was really high engagement because they were able to make it their own, and the students love when they can do that. Sorry, I'm going really slow. MSLS 3-1 was my next one that I decided to do. Develop and use a model to describe why structural changes to genes, mutations located on chromosomes may affect proteins and may result in harmful, beneficial, or neutral effects to the structure and function of the organism. So the students are learning how not all mutations are harmful and how some are beneficial and some are neutral, and how these mutations affect the survival of an organism or a species. And so for the activity that I focused or spotlighted was they were in small groups of 4, and they had to randomly draw a genetic code out of a bag. And the genetic code, they'd look at the key and say what mutation or not mutation they got. So there was 3 different stations or 3 different simulations. There was locomotion, eye color, and claws. And so for like eye color was, I'll just focus on eye color for the sake of time. So they either had to wear clear glasses, which was actually a mutation, look through a blue lens, so like blue plastic lens or glasses, which was considered normal for this alien species, or they had to look through a red or purple lens, which were also considered mutations. And what they had Fruit Loops, because that was what they ate, colored cereal or whatever the whole spiel of the activity was, and they had to eat it in a certain order, but first they had to sort them out, right? And they had 3 of each color of Fruit Loops, and they had to wear their lens, and they were timed, and they had to sort them out by color. And you had to see which mutations were beneficial, which ones were harmful, and which ones were neutral. And obviously the student that was lucky enough to draw clear got the beneficial trait, and they could sort those out in a matter of seconds, like as in 6. But the student that got a red lens was absolutely at the disadvantage. Like that was definitely harmful. They struggled immensely to sort them because all of your warm colors, your red, orange, yellow Fruit Loops, all look the same under a red lens. So it took them a long time and several tries before they got them organized. And so this was super high engagement because it put in that mild competition and that inconsequential competition. Like they're competing with each other because they wanted to win. But it also put in the fact that like they had a harmful trait and they were not going to win versus somebody with a clear lens looking through safety glasses, just clear safety glasses. And it also used physical movement because they got to get up, and for the locomotion one, they had to walk a different way to get their Fruit Loops. And it was just a high energy. This one was probably the most engagement, along with the next one that I'm going to talk about. So the next one is MSLS 4-4. Construct an explanation based on evidence that describes how genetic variation of traits in a population increase some individuals' probability of surviving and reproducing in a specific environment. So in this lesson, the students learned about natural selection, essentially, and the idea that if a trait is beneficial to the organism's survival, the organism is more likely to live longer, to reproduce, and all of that. And so we did the Battle of the Beaks for this. And what happened is, so there's again in small groups, which I love doing small groups because it helps keep the engagement up. And it also used inconsequential competition because I let them pick as long as they didn't fight, and I had no fights, so that wasn't a problem, of what beak they got. So they either got a binder clip beak, a clothespin beak, a tweezer beak, or a fork beak. And they had to, and then there was 4 different types of food. There was macaroni, like uncooked macaroni, pinto beans, rubber bands, and paper clips. And so we did several different situations where it's just, they each had to go for just pinto beans, and we record how much each beak was able to get, and then they each had to go for just clothespin, or not clothespins, I'm sorry, just macaroni, then just rubber bands, and then for the final one they had to put it all together in a big soup, is what we called it, in the table, and had to figure out who could eat the most, the fastest, and who was the most successful. And then when they answered questions, one of the questions that was really, really good was which beaks collected the most, which beaks collected the least. We can assume that the birds that collected the most food will survive and reproduce, and the birds that collected the least will die. What will the next generation look like? So based on what they use in their what they found in their experiment or activity, they had to tell me what their next generation would look like. And there's actually 4 questions that were kind of like that, all different, but had that same thought process. And that was another high engagement one. That was probably my second best, besides the mess it made, because the binder clips shooting macaroni and beans everywhere was kind of a mess, but the kids love it. And science is messy, so we just engulf the mess, I guess. So then the final one I did is MSLS 4-6, use mathematical representations to support explanations of how natural selection may lead to increases and decreases of specific traits in populations over time. So for this standard, students will get to see evidence and the math behind the idea that natural selection results in increases and decreases of traits found in the species. And they did an online simulation of the peppered moths, and I don't know if you're aware of what the peppered moths, but during the Industrial Revolution, pollution, or in Europe, like the pollution got really bad, and the pollution caused the trees to change colors. Well, the moths that were, the trees used to be light, and so all the moths were light to blend in with the trees. Well, not all of them, but the most successful moths were light. But then when and then there's dark moths, but those were most likely to get eaten by predators because they couldn't hide as well. But then when the Industrial Revolution changed the color of the forest, the dark moths became more successful because they were able to hide. So the dark moth population increased while the light moth population decreased. And this was more of a self-stimulus for engagement, Marzano's page 101. And I'm going to be honest, this was the least engaged of the 5 that I did. 7th graders don't have a lot of self-motivation or self-engagement. I think if it's not not in a group, or if it's not if I don't talk it up a lot and kind of bring it, build up their intentions for it. But so this was it wasn't a buzz. The students learned a lot, but it just wasn't quite as at the engagement level, especially my 3 and 4. My standards 3 and 4. Those ones were super engaged. This one was not quite at that level. But so this is my engagement table. I'm still learning, obviously. I will always be learning, and I told my principal that last week. I've grown a lot this year, but I still have a lot of growth to do. And these are some of them. I tried to pick activities that had been really successful for the most part. But I also wanted to be real and realistic, and they haven't all been successful or have been as engaged as I was intending, like my number 5 standard. Sorry this kind of went a little long, but thank you. And